So let's now look at the passage that we've got today, which is Matthew 10:34. It's what I planned for last week. The reason I want to share it with you is it is absolutely one of the most abused and misunderstood passages in all the New Testament. And one of my great frustrations is to see people use this passage, this difficult saying of Christ, to justify violence, church-giving violence. And it has been used that way for century after century. And even today, when conflict occurs or there are violent acts between nations, you will see Christians write, well, Jesus said that that's what he came to do. He came with a sword. He did not come to establish peace. So obviously that makes it right there a hard saying or a difficult passage. So how do we get to the truth of this? We see what the problem is. The problem is, for one thing, there's several problems. Let's start with the problem of we think of Jesus in regards to peace. What do we call Jesus in regards to peace?
The Prince of Peace.
The Prince of Peace, exactly. We think of his birth, which in itself is the story of his birth, which is a story of peace. I mean, on that night of his birth. So in Matthew, in the very gospel, in which Jesus says this 10 chapters later, we see the Messiah immediately associated with a promise of peace. And we see other cases where, without doubt, Jesus associates the Messiah with peace, and he associates himself with peace. He will say to people, peace be upon you. My peace, in John, my peace I give to you. Not as others give, do I give to you. This is a theme of his. So we have to kind of figure out what he's saying here. And then we have this image of a sword. And what are we going to do with that? Well, a sword is not only literally means, and usually the word in Greek is the short stabbing sword used by the Roman soldiers. I forget the name of it. It's the short sword that they kept on their hip. The killing sword, basically, not the ceremonial one. But it also was a highly metaphorical word in the New Testament, which Jesus used constantly. The sword being, you think about the judgment. The image of judgment as a sword. The image of the word as a sword. In fact, there are graphic, artistic references to the book of Revelations where it shows the Lamb of God with the sword coming out of the Lamb of God's mouth. And that, of course, is a metaphor for the word of the Lord, which judges, which divides. So we're going to talk about that image as well. One of the things I remember when I think about the sword is my trip to Switzerland, and to see, and just to get in touch with the Reformed Church. And one of the statues, I forget where it was, Basel, I think, I forget where. But in the middle of the square is a statue of Zwingli, the reformer. He was kind of a radical guy, with a Bible in one hand and a real sword in the other. And believe me, that wasn't symbolic, not for Zwingli. One of the things that Luther really rebelled, and they used this passage to justify, some of the more violent reformers used this passage to justify their violence, whether it was against Roman Catholics or against others. Luther was stunned at this. He hated this. He found himself caught between, and he strongly said, no, this violence that is occurring is not what we intended with the Reformation. So the passage, when it's isolated, when it's taken out of its context, leads to a lot of different problems. So let's begin with just taking a look at the relationships between what Jesus says here and other things that he says in Matthew. We start with Matthew. So let's start with I came to. Do not suppose that I came to establish peace on earth. I did not come to establish peace, but a sword. I came to. It is the voice of Christ or the Messiah's intentions. What did Jesus come to do? Jesus would always identify his intentions. He would also identify the Messiah's intentions. So this statement in Matthew 10 relates to his mission statement, relates to what he's now. That could be the idea of, and we'll get to this, an intentional mission. I came to do this specifically, and I'm doing it, or the result of his presence and his mission. I came to establish peace. I did not come to establish peace but a sword, because of the result of what? My presence. Because of the result of the reality of who the Messiah is. So this is a mission statement. You know, churches have mission statements. And this is a mission statement. And we see Jesus use these words in other places in Matthew, and I wanted to share that with you very quickly. Jesus says it in 5:17, where he says, and this is just after the Beatitudes, he says, do not think, and remember we looked at this passage, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. The same pattern in Jesus' words, starting with the negative and leading to the positive. I did not come. I came instead. I did not come what you expect. So, there were expectations of the Messiah, right? There were expectations of the Messiah. And the Messiah, from the Old Testament, the expectation was related to peace, but it wasn't the kind of peace that Jesus says the Messiah, that he came to give as the Messiah. It was a peace based upon politics. It was a peace based upon world domination. It was the peace that Israel believed itself, its purpose was to be the greatest nation among all nations. And it would be through the conquest of other nations and of the Roman Empire or whatever that this peace would be made. In other words, it was something like the peace that the Jewish or that the Old Testament or the Messianic tradition thought of was something like the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which, as we know, was enforced at the point of a spear, right? It wasn't peace as we think of it. So this mission statement, this idea of using pax or shalom with the word peace, was a way of Jesus saying the Messiah is not who you think the Messiah is. And the purpose of the Messiah is not the purpose that you think. This is all leading up to the shocking statement that Jesus is going to make to his followers in a few verses. And in this case, he's speaking not only to his disciples, but he's speaking to everyone that's listening to him. So you know, and I'm sure by now, we're in chapter 10 in the story, I'm sure by now people are beginning to urge Christ to take up the sword, to challenge Rome. This happened throughout his ministry. You know, be on our side. The zealots would want him to join them, to lead them, rise up against Rome, which they would do a few years later. And what would happen when that happens? Jerusalem would fall. Israel would fall. And that clearly, Jesus is, and it was, by the way, many people, many rebels would claim the Messiahship at this time. And they tried to gather an army to go against the hated Roman Empire. So they even associated in just their contemporary culture the Messiah with an uprising, with rebellion. And remember, the charge against Jesus was he called himself a king. He made himself a king, and he was crucified as a rebel. Crucifixion was only reserved for sedition. Only for sedition. It was not used for any other reason. So he was charged with basically being a traitor to Rome, and that's how the Passover plot, that's how the religious leaders were able to get him to the cross, through that. We also see this language of intention, this mission statement, in Matthew 9:13. And let me get to that real quick. My apologies, I just need to jump to this. I brought my text. I always say to myself, Mack, mark your text. Somehow I'm doing other things. I forget. So 9:13 says, makes another part of this mission statement. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call, here's that negative again, not the righteous, but sinners. There's a pattern here. For I have come to call, not the righteous, but sinners. Okay? He again establishes, who himself, who the Messiah truly is, who's God's Messiah truly is, and what God's mission is. It's not to call the righteous, but to call people who are willing to acknowledge their sin. The last reference to this language is close on. It's 20:28, where it says, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Let me start at 26. It will not be so among you, but whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So these are your expectations of who the Messiah is supposed to be, and that's the negative. And here's who the Messiah really is, folks. Here's the real mission of the Messiah. Okay? So, now, having heard this passage, his listeners might have been expecting the Messiah to be exactly who they expected him to be, because he said, I did not come to establish peace on earth, but a sword. And they expected the Messiah to lead them in wielding a sword against Israel's enemies. That was part of their expectation. Okay? So Jesus, using this intentional language, is trying to shock his listeners into the reality of who he is. He knows what they expect of the Messiah. He's shocking them by telling them, this is who the Messiah is. And it's going to get worse as he goes on in the passage, as the passage follows. He's really going to shock them.
The bread that you have
in just a
is the
few
bread
minutes.
that's left.
So let's look at this word peace. Peace in relationship to the Messiah. But the way to peace, according to Christ, is not the way of avoidance of conflict. That's often how peace is defined, as an avoidance of conflict. What's the problem with that definition? What's the problem with saying that peace is the avoidance of conflict? Bullies win. Excellent. Excellent. Bullies win. Peace can be that little circle that we draw around ourselves and say, I don't want to get involved. That's the problem, right? We see ugliness, we see bad things happen to people we know, and we see bad things happen in the world, and we don't want to get involved. We want to be at peace. Therefore, in that definition, peace is the avoidance of conflict. Let me tell you, all of us want to avoid conflict. We really do. I am one of the worst. I want to run and hide when conflict emerges. And that's really bad when you're a minister. Because not only are you going to experience conflict, you are going to create conflict. It's funny because the way we work in the Presbyterian Church, we make decisions through debates, which is conflict. It's funny because I remember studying conflict management when I was several years ago, and I studied it in working on my doctoral ministry. And the first thing that we learned is you can't avoid conflict. In fact, the Presbyterian Church makes decisions through conflict, but it is controlled conflict, using appropriate language using everybody takes their turn. And I learned there were 5 levels of conflict. Okay? 5 levels of conflict. Number 1 is just ordinary debate. I disagree with you, you disagree with me. Number 2 is something to the effect, I strongly disagree with you. That's a level 2 conflict. And you strongly disagree with me. We recognize that. Level 3 is, not only do I disagree with you, but you are wrong. That's when you get to level 3. You are wrong. Okay? I'm right, you're wrong. No question about it. Level 4 is, this is true. This is how we measure it in churches. Level 4 is, I'm right, you're wrong, and you need to leave. We're running you off. Level 4. And churches do experience level 4 conflict. You need to leave. Okay? Level 5 is, before you leave, I'm going to get my gun. That's level 5. I've never seen a level 5, although I have heard, I've talked to one minister where the conflict was so bad that somebody cut that minister's brake line. Yeah. And then that minister left ministry, which you would expect. I would leave probably the country after that. So, conflict is a part of the church, and you can't avoid it. And we all want to. But we have to learn, obviously, the church the way to do it. So, Jesus is saying here that if you're going to follow me, you can't avoid conflict. Because following me creates conflict. Where does it create conflict first? If you're going to follow, yes, say it, Papa. Inside yourself. I mean, compare yourself to what Jesus says you're supposed to be. Yeah, theologian over here. Compare yourself to what Jesus says you're supposed to be. Where does repentance come from? It comes from conflictedness. It comes from recognizing that you have failed, or that you need forgiveness, or that you need grace. So that conflict begins within. And then when you accept that and you follow Christ, Christ makes it clear, following him, you're going to be led into conflict. How do you understand what it means when our mission leads us into conflict? Now that's a very personal thing, there's no right answer. So, can you think of ways in which our mission leads us into conflict? Yes? Excellent. The neighborhood not liking the church, being here for different reasons. Okay? Just our being the church, our presence creates conflict. Boy, do we know this. This church knows this really well. Okay? And that's with just the things we do. What about the mission? Does our mission create conflict? And if so, where? Or how? How does our mission create conflict? Good. Say that again, one more time. We shouldn't be serving these particular people. They are bad people. They are people we don't like. One of the things, what's that? They're not like us. One of the things the early Christian church did that even no other gathering did was welcome the sick, the infirm, the physically infirm, the mentally infirm into their worship. Nobody else did. And that really troubled some in the church and many people outside of the church. In fact, you will recall, and I've said this many times in my classes and in the pulpit, what were the Christians accused of by those who really didn't understand what they were doing? What were they accused of? Do you remember? Yeah.
Some felt they were cannibals.
Cannibalism was one. Why?
Because of the Lord's Supper.
Because of the supper.
They heard that they were eating the body and drinking the blood of some man.
Yes. One of my favorite scenes, I may have shared this with you from the movie Gandhi, was when the Episcopal priest, the radical Episcopal priest, is now traveling with the Untouchables through India, and he's sitting on the roof. And one of the Untouchables, as they are labeled, says to him, "You're a Christian?" And the priest says, "Yes, I am." He goes, "Christians drink blood." And you see the look on the priest's face, and then the Untouchable smiles and says, "Blood of Christ." So just I crack up whenever I see that scene. But that's what they thought. They also thought that they were incestuous. Why? Why? What would make them think that Christians were incestuous?
Because we're called brothers and sisters.
Brothers and sisters. Then they call each other brothers. And really, there are letters written to authorities in Rome asking about, is this true or not? And one letter, the letter to Trajan or Pliny, I think that's it. Anyway, writes back and says, "Well, I went to one of their gatherings. We tortured two of their deacons who were women. They tortured them, and what we learned is they're just ordinary people. They're not a problem. They're not a problem. Because obviously, if we torture them, they're going to tell us. I think torturing was a problem in and of itself. So just the very existence, who we say we are, creates conflict. And there's a dangerous line, as I think about it. There's a dangerous line when we think about it, about, our unwillingness to allow the church to be a conflicting presence. I mean, we do make a declaration, don't we? That Jesus Christ is the Messiah of all the earth. That's conflicting. That can be viewed as a judgment upon other people and other religions. So when we talk about the primacy of Christ, as we believe, as Christians state, we don't, what you're not to follow with is that means everybody goes to hell who doesn't believe, because then you step into God's seat. But we do talk about the primacy of Christ. It's like all roads lead through Christ. Yes?
I find that the biggest conflict I have with people is having the entire history of the Christian church and all of the horrible things that they've done attributed to me because I call myself a Christian.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, part of the problem we're having today in the Reformed Church, we don't distinguish ourselves enough from other Christian traditions. We need to do that. And we're going to. Reformed Christianity is very different from fundamentalism. It's very different from that label, and I hate this label, evangelical. Because we're evangelical, which means just declare the good news. But unfortunately, it has become a political label. Yeah, and yes, exactly. So, Jesus says, you're going to follow me, you're going to enter conflict. You're going to enter conflict. Sword, he uses the word sword. Now, here's where we know that it's metaphorical. Because if you read in Matthew 26, 51 and 52, this is what we read. Well, you know what happened in this. It's the forbidding of using the sword. 26, 51, 52. There it is. Okay. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." And that is the literal sword, okay? So, seeing this being forbidden, and the judgment that comes with using the sword, you have to live by the sword, to die by the sword. What does sword mean here? Well, clearly, as I said, there are lots of ways the word is used. But here, it is simply a metaphor for conflict and suffering, and one which Christ used regularly. He talked about it all the time. He used the sword as an image. He used the sword as an image many, many times. So it's simply a metaphor for conflict and suffering. Yes?
And people who say it's not a metaphor, it's literal. You could ask them, well, so do you think every time Jesus talked about sheep, he was talking about sheep?
Exactly. Exactly. Oh, and you could go on with that. You could take go on and on. Sure. But I mean, that's part of the struggle with fundamentalism, you know. And so, you know, this isn't a promotion of violence, obviously. However, it is telling us something. So let's find out what it's telling us. Let's go to the expansion real quick. Number 3 in the outline. Now we see what he's talking about. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. This is what we read in Micah. There is some Old Testament tradition for these words. In Micah 7:6, we read, well, I'll start with 5. Put no trust in a friend. Have no confidence in a loved one. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. And that comes under the heading, the total corruption of the people. Now, why do you think Jesus would be so specific about the family conflict that he creates? Think of some reasons why you think that Jesus would be very specific here about this. Think of some reasons that, imagining the situation at the time, think of why he might have said this.
Well, all of these people are under the power of the person they're talking about, and being a good person.
Very good.
Of course, follow your elders.
Very sharp. Very sharp. I mean, I didn't notice the age difference. And the age difference is a generational thing. As you said so astutely, it's a power thing. You're under the power, okay? And you are countering that power with what? Claiming a higher power, right? Higher power. Now also think about the real situation in life when Jesus is there doing this. The real situation in life. What's going on when he says these words? What do you think's going on? He's speaking about reality here. He's being specific. So what's happening?
His followers are leaving their families or going against their families.
Not necessarily leaving, but what's happening to his followers?
Well, they're following him before his family.
And what is happening to them? Go, keep going. You got it.
Disowned.
They're being disowned. Yes. Yes. But even more interesting, Jesus is also talking about himself. That's what's interesting. We always ask the question, what was Jesus' family life like? Mary, you know, Joseph's not in the scene. We don't know where Joseph is. And Jesus is on. But what we do know, and we get all of this, almost all of this from the Gospel of John, is that Jesus had some serious conflict with his brothers and sisters. Serious conflict. Can you remember some of that? Does any of that come to mind as you think about it? Yeah, quickly.
The one I remember is when the brothers are taunting him
Yes,
about going up to the festival.
exactly.
You know, if you're supposed to be the Messiah,
Yeah.
you ought to show yourself openly. Why are you hiding?
Exactly.
And they don't believe that he is the Messiah, so they're taunting him.
Yeah, very good. And then there's that time when Jesus is speaking these deeply spiritual things, including, I am the bread of life. You must eat of me. and someone comes to him and goes, your brother and your mother are outside. They want you to come out. They want you to come out. Basically because they thought that he was crazy. That what he was saying, I'm not saying that. They felt it put him in danger, I'm assuming. That he needed to stop saying this stuff. So they actually come to get him. And remember how Jesus responds? What does he do? He looks around him and says what? These are my brothers, my sisters, my mother. These are. I mean, that is radical. That is radical. He just simply says, I don't even belong to them anymore. I don't even belong to them. What was Jesus' position in his family?
Well, he was the oldest
Exactly. Oldest what?
son. And probably favored by his mother. And therefore, they were jealous, maybe.
Could be. But he had responsibilities as an elder son in a Jewish household. He was the banker. He was the one that would sign papers. We're assuming Joseph died, because we just don't see Joseph. So that put a lot of pressure on him to take those responsibilities. And the closest we can come to understanding what happened is James, Jesus' younger brother, who Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, and James then became a leader in the church in Jerusalem. But James was probably the second younger brother. Did you ever see any conflict between Jesus and Mary?
Yes.
At the wedding?
Go ahead.
At the wedding?
At the wedding, what happens?
Well, she wants him to make the water into wine, and he doesn't want it.
You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Woman, what have you to do with me? It's not my time. Woman, what have you to do with me? And what I love is, Mary doesn't ask him to turn the water into wine. He goes to her, she goes to him and just looks at him and says, they have no wine. What are you going to do about it? They have no wine. And then what about the story of when Jesus, as we had in Bible school, we studied the story, when Jesus went to the temple. I love this story. At the age of 12. And Mary thought he was with Joseph, and Joseph thought he was with Mary, and they look at each other and go, well, I thought he was with you. Well, I thought he was with you. They walk all the way back and find him, and Mary just says it beautifully. How could you do this to us? How could you do that? I mean, such a parent thing to say. How could you do this to us? No, it's great. I love this stuff. So there's tons. So Jesus clearly, and if he's saying this and they're sitting out there listening, you know, they're certainly going to hear it. Jesus did have conflict in his call. We forget this. We forget that he was fully human, just like us. And he experienced the same family troubles that we all experience. Maybe even tougher. Because, you know, if your brother or any family member claims to be the Son of God, well, how are you going to respond to that? Get out of here. Get him some help. Get him to the home, whatever you want to say. And that's clearly how they responded. You know, I mean, obviously, his brothers would. It took the resurrection to convince at least some of them that it was real. So the sword here that he mentioned, and here's where we kind of get closer to the image of the sword, because depending on what translation you have, I have come to divide. The word divide is used. Now, I don't have that in the translation that I used here, but in other translations, the word divide is used. So the sword is the sword of division. Division. I've come to divide. And what I've come to do is to create a spiritual family. And this spiritual family isn't just there to make you feel good. This spiritual family demands loyalty over all your relationships. You are loyal to the Messiah first, and that means conflict. That means conflict. Yeah, well.
I was just thinking about how Jesus uses hyperbole, he uses exaggeration
Yes.
for effect. And it's tempting for us to put the emphasis on Jesus' words that he's creating conflict. But the conflict was there.
Oh,
The
yeah.
conflict has been there from the fall. And so actually Jesus is coming to bring unity among those who will follow him and to allow the others to perish. And so it's not like he's creating the conflict.
Exactly.
We created the conflict in the fall and have chosen to go our own way.
Yes. Well, even beyond that, the religion of Israel and the society at that time that Jesus was born into was a highly stratified society. It was built upon conflicts and divisions. Built upon that. When you go into the temple, you go from the court of the Gentiles to the court of the women. And the Gentiles can't go beyond that. The women cannot go beyond that. So it's a whole culture built upon conflict. So no, exactly correct. And of course, our sin is our conflict with God. Exactly correct. We see this in Paul's family. It's kind of hinted at in Paul's family as well. What I want to show you down the bottom, verse 37. This is from Deuteronomy, verse 37, what we just read, for Deuteronomy 33. And this is kind of a connection to Jesus' demand for loyalty. And of Levi. Remember, the Levites were the tribe that were dedicated the closest to following the law and were given authority, religious authority, in the earliest days of Israel. And of Levi, he said, give to Levi your Thummim and your Urim. That's the dice that help them. In other words, give them authority to your loyal one, whom you tested at Massah, with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and mother, I regard them not. He ignored his kin and did not acknowledge his children, for they observed your word and kept your covenant. So the Levites were held up because of their willingness to place God above their familial relationships. They were held up. They took a vow. So this kind of connects what Jesus is saying of this family conflict to something we see even in Deuteronomy, where dedicating oneself to following God is going to separate you from things in your life, whether you like it or not. Then there is, okay, so on the back. This follows on the back. Yep, Will, go ahead. You had something?
Well, I was thinking it wasn't an either-or situation. It wasn't like Jesus said, follow me and forget your family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he loved his family. And on the cross,
Yes.
he gave his mother to John and
Yes.
John to his mother. He was caring for her even as he was suffering. So it's not an either-or situation. He was just outlining the priorities.
Yes, exactly.
I'm first.
I'm first, exactly. Yes. Let's look at some of those ideas. I'm not going to go through the Matthew 12 where Jesus has distanced himself from his family. We've already seen that. But that distance is not physical, it's spiritual. You know, I am the Messiah. I am human, but also I have to obey the will of my Father. It's a spiritual kind of separation. And then I like this theme of worthiness in these verses. Let's look at that word. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. How do you understand that word worthy? What does the word worthy mean? Are you worthy of that?
Value.
What? Value? Good. Value? Deserving. Good. What else? So what do you think Jesus is saying here? Whoever loves something or these folks more than me is not worthy of me. What does that mean?
I don't know, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those uncomfortable phrases, isn't it? Yeah. That idea of worthiness. But remember, worthiness is associated with who here? Who? Well, who's he speaking to? No, he's speaking to a specific group.
The disciples?
Disciples, particularly apostles. In other words, they were specifically called by Christ. And believe me, as Christ journeyed, disciples, we know the 12 stayed with him, but we see the disciples left him, especially in John, where he looks at the 12 and goes, are you going to leave me too? Are you going to leave me as well? And that's when Peter says, we'll never leave you. We'll never leave you. So worthiness is, I think, a sense of very specific call to the purpose for which the Messiah came. You know, in other words, and I think he shows this in many of his parables. When he says, when someone says, let me go bury my brother first. And Jesus says, Jesus calls this person. And he said, let the dead bury the dead. You need to follow me now. You know, worthiness, if you're going to answer the call, not just believe, but if you're going to answer the call, worthiness demands sacrifice. Worthiness demands sacrifice. Go ahead, Will.
Well, I was just thinking how the good news needs to be preceded by the bad news. And the bad news is that none of us are worthy. And it's Christ who, by his sacrifice, makes us worthy.
Yes.
And so the worthiness is all of him, not of any sacrifice I can make.
Yes.
Not of any works I can do.
Right.
He makes me worthy.
And that's that's what the cross is. And that's what the cross is. But I think it's also a way to look at this of, he's speaking to those who have given their lives to him to follow him. What is their job going to be when he goes to his Father's kingdom? What are they going to do?
They're going to face the wolves.
Man, you know? And he's trying, I think, to prepare them for what they're going to face. Also, I want to point out in this passage where he goes, whoever loves father or mother more than me, whoever loves son or daughter more than me. I think that word there, the love word, is not a quantitative description. Not the amount of love that you give to Jesus as compared to your father and mother, but it's a qualitative description. A qualitative description. In other words, spiritual love that is between us is different from the love that you have in your life with your family. And what's that?
John in there somewhere?
John's in there, and
Whoever believes in me
yes,
have everlasting.
and even more, Paul's in there. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but do not have love, and what is the Greek word that is used there for love? Agape. That was not the word used in family relationships. It is the word used here. Agape. Spiritual love. Higher love that's used here. So I think it's a qualitative difference. And I always like to say that the reason Paul couched this in this language, and you will hear me say this when I do funeral services or memorial services, is that, faith, hope, and love, these three abide, but the greatest of these is love. Why is love the greatest? Well, when you go to be with God, be with Christ, you don't need faith anymore. You're there. When you go to be with Christ, you don't need hope anymore. So what's the one thing we carry with us from here to there? Love. That's why it's the greatest of these. Love is the same, whether here or whether with God or Christ in the way. So love is the highest standard given that Jesus gives. Love for God, love for Christ, love for each other, especially among the brothers and sisters in the church. So I think it's a quantitative, not a qualitative. Because I think, obviously, the disciples and the followers, and Jesus himself, as Will said, love their family. Love their family. But that is not the spiritual love. I got plenty of time. We're good. Okay. So the kingdom of God tests one's priorities. The kingdom of God tests one's priorities. What comes first? What comes first? The spiritual love, the love that lasts from here to there, or the love that comes between not just family, but other people that can be there or not, can, so forth and so on. That's malleable. It's malleable. Because when we say we love Christ and we give our hearts to Christ, there are times I feel I'm not loving Christ as I should. But as Christians, we still love Christ. We love God. I mean, we still love, and God understands that. That's the agape. But that's different than romantic love or the love of mind, the mindful love, or any of those other ones. Okay, let's move on then. I want to talk about crucifixion, and this is pick up my cross. You must pick up your cross and follow me. And on the back page here, verse 38. Crucifixion was regarded with horror by the Jews. I love what my commentary said. It said, today we hear that and we don't even believe. We even wear crosses around our neck, right? Back then, some would have fainted had they heard. Because crucifixion was the ugliest, most anti-God form of death.
Alien.
Yes, that there was. There was nothing more ugly than crucifixion. It carried the stigma of social disgrace. So can you imagine how shocking these words would have been? It's amazing anybody followed Jesus. It really is. When you consider at that time what he said. When you consider how he lifted up crucifixion. When he said to his followers, you must pick up your cross and follow me. Whoa. Nobody picked up their cross and followed anybody. That's not how it worked in that culture. Nobody could. That's correct. That's correct. Carrying the cross was a public act of humiliation. And Christians, this is what part of what Jesus is saying. Christians were expected to experience humiliation and show humility. And they were humiliated. In that spirit, in that sense, when his followers were brought before others. Well, we talked about the torture of the deaconesses that we read about from history. They were humiliated. Furthermore, they were expected to show humility. Okay, so carrying the cross means, could mean literally martyrdom, as many of the apostles, or all the apostles, as we understand it, were martyred. Although we don't have a real clear history of that. Not 100%. We're not sure. But many followers were martyred. Many are still martyred today. Martyrdom is always a part of Christianity, depending upon your circumstance. We forget that sometimes. It's always been. It always will be. It always will be.
It's power
Yes. Yeah.
when you make somebody a martyr.
Yeah. But I don't think Jesus here, I think when Jesus talks about the possibility of their dying, he's relating it to the fact that he's going to die. So you join with me in my, now out of that, in fact, out of the martyrdom of the early Christians, Christianity grew like crazy because people saw the way they martyred, the way they went to the cross. And it impressed them. I mean, the way that they were martyred. But for Christ, it means that this is always a possibility. And for his apostles, he said, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. Also, as I say here, Christianity is also meant to be lived out in public. Christianity is not a private belief. It's not private. Now, there are private parts of piety to that. Go into your room, close the door, and pray. But Christianity puts you out in the world. Puts you out in the world. You can't hide. What's that?
Whosoever.
Yeah, I mean, you go out into the world with Christianity. We do that as the church. Yeah, but
Well, I was thinking about how that's manifest, like in the workplace. And it's not that you're standing at the corner of the hallway preaching the gospel.
Right.
But it's you're doing your work with the principles of the gospel. And so you're being honest, which can be very radical at work.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
that you're choosing,
Very, very radical.
that you're choosing to do the next right thing
Mhm.
instead of what's convenient, you know, to get by.
Mhm.
So you're not taking shortcuts, you're doing the right thing, you're being honest. That makes you radical, and it creates conflict. Well, would you shut up? Just do your own thing, you know? Don't bring this down on the rest of us.
Yeah.
Because you're doing the right thing. We want
Yeah.
to escape.
Exactly. Very good. Yeah, Bob.
For me, the hardest thing is not being honest and being kind. Always being kind, because often people I deal with are not particularly kind to me.
I know.
So turning the other cheek,
I
and
know.
it's every day.
It's an inner battle, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I've got
Yeah.
better at it.
Yeah. That's the reason I used to wear a collar and I don't anymore. Because I'm not good enough to wear it. I don't help the kingdom when I wear a collar, especially when I'm driving. I am not assisting the kingdom.
You shouldn't have a bumper sticker either.
I don't wear the collar anymore. So,
Are there any religions that are not public?
oh yeah, secret cults. Cults are very, they are religions, and cults are not public. I mean, you can name all of them.
Well, they are to some extent. They're within the cult. They're certainly very public.
Right, but they close themselves off from the world.
Now, but
In other words,
that closing off is a public act.
it's true. But what cults tend to say is you come in, and once you're part of us, right, once you're part of us, but what Christ says is we go out, and it doesn't matter if this is the way we interpret it.
I didn't say it was the same, but
Right. I mean, it's a good question. Yeah, but I think, that's a really tough question. I'm sure let's put it this way. If there are secret religions, we probably don't know about it.
Jewish culture and law was very public
Yes.
because it prescribed
Yes, it was.
how they were supposed to act.
Mhm. But they were a political entity as well as a spiritual
Yeah.
entity. They lived out, and the law was the law the same way we get parking tickets.
Now, you might argue that the Ten Commandments made a shift.
Yes. Oh, no, it did. It was the ground of it. It was the ground.
Still, it's essentially all religions are public.
I think to be a religion, the implication is you're public.
Yeah.
I think that's the case. I think within religion, there are secrets and there are walls. I agree with you. So I want to be careful about that. But the point is that Jesus says, just as it's a public walk, but you're going to pick up a cross, everybody's going to see you do it. They lined up to watch the condemned. So I'm putting that he's not just talking about humility, but the public act of being a Christian, of following Christ. What was Peter's great sin? How did Peter fail Christ? He denied him. See? Publicly. Yeah. And of course Jesus forgave him, but 3 times. That's what I mean. Okay, so we're going to finish up now, and I apologize for a little later. We'll finish up. Okay, those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. The word is psyche, which means spiritual life. And it is that kind of life. There are different words for life in the Greek, but psyche means both body and soul. It keeps them separate but puts them together. And that's important. So in this particular passage, the use of psyche twice, the use of life twice, is a play on the 2 senses of what psyche means. It broadens the scope of this saying, and I'm just reading it, by contrasting the mere earthly existence, which can be preserved by evading martyrdom, but at the cost of the real spiritual self, with the true life, which is inclusive, holistic, which does not depend on physical survival, and which may need to be preserved precisely by a willingness to go through literal death for Jesus. This is a huge stumbling block in the church because it really divides Christians from each other. The idea, as we see it in the Reformed Church, is that we are now living that life now. That the kingdom life begins in the here and now. Okay? We believe after death that kingdom life will continue so that what we have here spiritually continues there. But there's another way of thinking about that which says, no, that's not the case. You got to get it here in order to have it there. And once you get it here, you need to, you're fine. You're set to go. You're ready to go. And the problem with that is, I think there's a problem with that theology. And there's a problem with that theology because it focuses on that constant, I gotta be saved, I gotta be saved, I gotta be saved, I gotta be saved. And if I'm not saved, well, and if I am saved, everything is great. What's that? Everything is awesome. The movie, the Lego movie. Everything is awesome. Yes, Jane?
When you're talking, I think of the civil rights ministers, the ministers during the civil rights period.
Oh, good.
Of speaking,
Good.
Speaking up and leading people to understand this love that Christ talked about.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and then be martyred, some of them.
Yes.
Many of them for that teaching of the love.
Yeah. One of the great conflicts, one of the great problems, one of the biggest conflicts in the early church was later on when people who had denied Christ, Christians who had denied Christ in order to save their families, to save their lives, the established church had to decide whether to let them back in or not. Because many had been martyred. They had to make that decision. I forget the exact story of that. I'd have to look it up. But they made the decision, as the bishops did, to let them back in and be forgiven. I think they went with exactly what Christ was talking about. But it was a real crisis for them because some had lost their family members. Others had gone ahead and gone, all right, I'll just say it in order to save myself or to save my family. And who of us would know what to do in that situation or what we would do? And I think the authorities in the early church recognized that, But we've got to find a way to get them back. So they confessed that they had been wrong. And they were welcomed back into the church. So, that was an early conflict. But I think what Jesus is saying here, that life is more than drawing breath or beating heart. And that following the Messiah opens yourself to the possibility that it might end your breath or your heart beating. It opens up to that possibility. But you have to accept that. Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking of John talking about, Jesus' words were, I came that they might have life abundant and eternal.
Very good, very good.
He's not talking about having lots of money or
Yes.
lots of material possessions,
Yes.
but the fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
It's all internal qualities
Yes.
that make us whole.
Yes.
And so that starts now.
Yeah.
God is creating that abundant life in us, that spirit within us,
Mhm.
that we're going to carry with us to heaven for
Yeah.
eternity.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that abundant life reorients you in this world. It reorients your way of thinking. That worthiness. For me, it tends to feel like it makes your life worthy. Makes your life worthy. I mean, isn't it true that there are plenty of people who accomplish everything they want in the world, as far as money, as far as family or whatever. But a lot of these people reach out for more. They reach out for purpose. And they may go do something, and it's wonderful when you do a benevolence, when you do these things, volunteer. They want to find something greater. This is a crisis that happens to parents once their children are raised in God. And they go. because you oriented your whole early years toward feeding, caring, educating a child. You've really worked at it, whether single parent or two parents. You've worked at it. And then they leave, they're done. What do I do now? What do I do? Huh?
Grandchildren.
No, they moved back home.
Yeah, that. I can tell you that from experience. Millennials are a different group to be parents of, let me assure you. But yeah, I mean, what I mean is that so many fall into very bad things because of the emptiness that they feel. Others embrace wonderful things. But there's a gap that they feel you have to fill. I think we, in following your faith, all the gaps are filled. Even in times of emptiness. That's the abundant life. And Jesus constantly talked about life as being overflowing. The cup overflows. The blessings are shaken, and pressed down. They overflow. I mean, it's images constantly he uses of this overflowing life. And what I like to do is, in concluding this, we've got to conclude, is the quote by F.F. Bruce on this passage. And this is what he says. So when Jesus said that he had come to bring not peace but a sword, he meant that this would be the effect of his coming, not that it was the purpose of his coming. His words came true in the life of the early church, and they have verified themselves subsequently in the history of Christian missions. You cannot avoid, if you're going to believe in Christ, you cannot avoid the effects of that on you and how you live your life. And how you live your life. And that is why we emphasize learning the Word, confessing the Word, and continuing to learn the Word to understand it, so that you can deal with the conflicts of life, so that we can navigate our way through them. That's why we're here doing this, to understand. Not to just go, okay, well, the Bible says that that's the end. Whatever it means. Whatever it means. No. Jesus wants us to understand what he means. It's really important that we do. It affects us. It affects our walking. So, I concluded by saying the kingdom life is always a public and sacrificial life, and the kingdom life will always have risks. Always. Always have risks. And we're not risk takers, but you never know when that demand is going to be made of you. What the context of that's going to be. Right? Doesn't matter if you go run off and do a mission way off in a dangerous place, or you're sitting here and tripping. Risk is a part of following Christ. You are set in opposition to something. Okay, any thoughts before we close with prayer? Yes?
There's a church down the street from us whose sign, the cross that they have on their sign is the sword.
What do they mean by that? Don't know. I mean, it's biblical, the image. But what do they mean? What do they associate? Yeah. Zwingli meant go cut off heads. Yeah, and he did.
Numerous groups that say that they will be not persecuted, but will advance the kingdom of heaven.
Right. Well, Revelation was written for persecuted Christians. That's why it's so hard for us here to connect with that. But believe me, in China or in other places, they're reading Revelation. Believe me. And it's comforting them. It's for people who are persecuted to say, we know you're suffering, we know you're dying, but God is still in control. God still controls history. God still is the ultimate end. And that's what Revelation's about. I just gave away my class for this. Come anyway, because there's still stuff to learn. Who's the Antichrist? I'm not going to tell you.
Alert.
You may have some ideas, but I'm not going to tell you. By the way, 1 John says there are antichrists. Uses the plural. Yeah.
Somewhere I read one time that one of the ways the Romans by using the crucifixion, and that you could go for miles
Yeah.
with crosses.
Well, that was the Spartacus story.
Yeah, I was thinking.
They, along the Appian Way, they nailed slaves to the cross all the way down. Yeah, what do you think that was? And they were rebellious. That's the ultimate punishment. And they hung there on the Appian Way till they rotted. Yeah, amazing to think about. Amazing to think, but that's the way it was. Yeah. Okay, what else? Anything else before we go? Thank you for your patience. Next week, we may do 2 verses to catch up. I'll have to look at it and see how involved it is, but we may do 2 verses. Let's bow our heads and pray. Lord, we thank you so much for bringing us here and struggling and wrestling to understand your word. We wrestle with many things, Lord, including the call that you give to us, which sometimes, Lord, sets us in opposition to ourselves and to others. Help us, Lord, to wrestle with that as you called us to. And to always embrace and rejoice in the abundant life that's given to us every day, because our life, Lord, our lives are tied to your purpose and not ours. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Thank you.